The cupboard door hung open. The blue mug wasn't there. I scanned the shelf again, my eyes tracing over the chipped white ones, the one with the faded corporate logo, the one shaped like a cat that wasn't mine. No blue mug. I shut the door harder than I needed to. The sound was a sharp crack in the morning quiet of the apartment. God damn it, I muttered to the empty kitchen. A dull throb started behind my right eye, the familiar companion to any effort of memory. The doctors called it a side effect of the incident. I called it a pain in the ass. I probably left the mug at the library. Or maybe it fell behind the couch. Again. My life was a collection of these little gaps. These misplaced objects and forgotten appointments. A frayed tapestry where the threads just ended. I settled for the white one, the one with a hairline crack running down its side. The coffee machine gurgled and hissed, dripping black liquid into the cup. The smell of it, dark and bitter, was one of the few things that felt reliably real. While it brewed, I started on the pile of clutter that had colonized the corner of my living room. Old mail, newspapers, a stack of books I didn't remember buying. Underneath it all was a jacket. A heavy, dark wool peacoat. It was worn at the cuffs and the collar was stiff, but I had no memory of it. None. It felt like finding a stranger's possession in my own home. I held it up. It didn't smell like me. It smelled of cold air and something else. Something metallic and faint, like old pennies. Curiosity, or maybe just boredom, made me run my hands over it. The wool was coarse. I slipped a hand into the right side pocket. My fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. It felt stiff, old. I pulled it out and unfolded it on the kitchen counter. It wasn't a receipt or a forgotten note. It was a map. Hand-drawn on a piece of paper torn from a notepad, the lines done in a shaky, thick black ink. It depicted a small section of a town, maybe a few blocks. Simple squares for buildings, thin lines for streets. There were 4 locations marked with a crude X. No names, no legend. Just the marks. A faint, almost imperceptible hum started in the back of my skull. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A flicker of recognition so brief I thought I'd imagined it. It was like seeing a face in a crowd you think you know, but by the time you look again, it's gone. I dismissed it. Probably some drunken scribble from the life before the incident, the life I couldn't access. I folded the paper, shoved it into the pocket of my jeans, and took a sip of my coffee. The crack in the mug pressed against my lip. The map stayed in my pocket all day, a small, square weight against my thigh. At my desk I tried to work. I proofread marketing copy. The words floated on the screen, meaningless shapes. My mind kept returning to the shaky lines, the 4 X marks. I'd pull it out, stare at it. It was nonsense. A meaningless doodle. But a current of something pulled at me. It was a physical sensation, an itch deep under my skin that I couldn't scratch. One of the X's was in a patch of green on the edge of the drawing, not far from where my apartment was located on a real city map. Next to it, a single phrase was scrawled in a jagged, cramped hand. Whisperwood Park. The name meant nothing to me. I'd lived here for 6 months, ever since I got out of the hospital, and I'd never heard of it. But the urge grew. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was an instruction my body was receiving from an unknown source. My legs started to bounce. My fingers drummed on the desk. The pressure built behind my eyes. Just go see it, I said out loud, the sound of my own voice startling me. Just go, see there's nothing there, and then you can throw the fucking thing out. It felt weak, a justification for a compulsion I couldn't explain. But it was enough. I grabbed my keys, not bothering to change out of the clothes I'd been wearing all day. I slammed the apartment door behind me. The walk was short, maybe 20 minutes. The crisp autumn air did nothing to clear my head. With every step the pressure amplified. I felt less like I was walking, and more like I was being reeled in by an invisible line. Whisperwood Park wasn't much of a park. It was a forgotten square of land wedged between the back of a warehouse and a rusted chain-link fence bordering a railway line. The sign was faded, the green paint peeled away to reveal rotting wood underneath. There was no grand entrance, just a narrow dirt path cutting through a patch of overgrown, yellowing grass. The place felt abandoned, left to die. I stepped onto the path. The dirt was soft, damp. It muffled the sound of my footsteps. Ahead, I could see it. A swing set. 2 swings, their chains the color of dried blood, hanging from a skeletal metal frame. It was exactly as I had pictured it in my head, a flash of an image I didn't know I possessed. My heart began to beat a little faster, a heavy, insistent rhythm against my ribs. As I got closer, a sound cut through the air, a high, thin squeak. I stopped. The sound came again. Squeak. A pause. Squeak. One of the swings, the one on the right, was moving. A gentle, back-and-forth motion. It was probably just the wind. I told myself that. The wind. I took another step closer. The squeaking continued, a monotonous, grating noise. The rhythm of it seemed to match my pulse. Thump thump. Squeak. Thump thump. Squeak. I looked around. The warehouses were silent. The railway was empty. There was no wind. The leaves on the skeletal trees around me were perfectly still. The air was cold and heavy. This was stupid. I turned to leave. I faced the path I'd just walked down. But it looked different. Longer. The trees on either side seemed to have grown, their bare branches lacing together overhead, forming a dark, tangled tunnel. Did it look like that when I came in? I couldn't be sure. A knot of cold tightened in my stomach. A damp chill, unrelated to the autumn air, began to creep up my spine. A low bank of fog, thick and unnaturally white, was rolling in from the direction of the railway tracks. It wasn't drifting. It was advancing. A silent, consuming wall that swallowed the fence, then the edge of the trees, then the entrance to the path. It slicked the dead grass with moisture and clung to my clothes. I was being sealed in. The world outside the park was disappearing. Then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A child's giggle. It was faint, carried on the damp air. My entire body went rigid. I wasn't alone. I ducked behind the thick, gnarled trunk of an old oak tree, my back pressing hard against the rough bark. The motion was pure instinct. My breath hitched in my throat. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to silence my own ragged breathing. The giggle came again, closer this time. It was a light, carefree sound that was hideously wrong in this dead, isolated place. My eyes darted around, trying to pierce the thickening fog. I saw nothing but shifting gray shapes and the dark skeletons of trees. Then, the swing on the right began to move more purposefully. It swung higher, faster, its chains groaning in protest. Back and forth, arcing through the mist as if an invisible body was pumping its legs, driving it forward. The seat was empty. I stared, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The sheer, physical impossibility of it was a vice around my chest. Higher and higher it went, the squeaking now a frantic, high-pitched shriek. The laughter erupted right beside my ear. It wasn't a distant echo anymore, it was immediate. Intimate. A clear, sharp, childish laugh. So close I felt a puff of cold air against the skin of my neck. I squeezed my eyes shut, a strangled sound dying in my throat. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My hands flew up to cover my ears, pressing my palms so hard against my head that my skull ached. But it did no good. The sound wasn't on the outside anymore. It was inside my head, echoing in the hollow spaces of my terror. My body started to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled my teeth. I curled into a ball at the base of the tree, making myself as small as possible. The world dissolved into the sound of shrieking metal and mocking laughter. Silence. It fell as suddenly as a blade. The laughter vanished. The groaning of the chains stopped. The only sound was the frantic hammering pulse in my ears and the rasp of my own breathing. I stayed frozen for a long time, my eyes screwed shut, my hands locked over my ears. Nothing happened. The silence stretched, deep and profound. Slowly, shakily, I lowered my hands. I peeled my eyelids open. The fog had thinned slightly, pulling back like a receding tide. The park was, as it was before, still, dead. The swing was motionless, hanging limp from its chains. A few drops of water, condensed from the fog, dripped from the seat onto the ground below. I pushed myself up, my legs feeling weak and unreliable. I had to get out. I took a stumbling step forward, my eyes fixed on the motionless swing. My gaze dropped to the ground beneath it. The earth was dark and wet, a patch of thick, black mud, where the dripping water had collected. Scratched into the surface of the mud were words. They were deep, carved with a sharp stick or a finger. The letters were jagged, a familiar, ugly scrawl. A fresh wave of cold, colder than the fog, washed through my veins. I knew that handwriting. The sharp, aggressive slant of the letters. The way the T was crossed high and with too much force. The way the Y looped back on itself. It was my handwriting. I leaned forward, my whole body trembling. My mind read the words my hand had apparently written. Not done yet. I ripped my gaze away from the mud. I scrambled backward, tripping over my own feet, my hands slipping on the wet, dead grass. My lungs burned. I had to get out. The path I'd come in on no longer looked like a tunnel. It was just a path again. The fog was gone. The world outside the park had returned. I ran. I didn't look back at the swing set. I didn't look at the mud. I fixed my eyes on the street beyond the rotted sign and forced my legs to move, one after the other. The sound of my own ragged gasps filled my ears. I burst out onto the sidewalk, stumbling into the indifferent afternoon light. The noise of a passing car made me flinch violently. Back in my apartment, the first thing I did was slam the deadbolt home. The solid chunk of the metal sliding into the frame was a small, momentary comfort. I leaned my back against the door, my body still shaking. My hands felt dirty, caked with the memory of the mud. I went to the sink and scrubbed them raw, watching the water swirl down the drain. It wasn't a hallucination. It couldn't have been. The dampness on my jeans, the scratches on my palms from the fall, the mud I could still almost feel under my fingernails. It was real. I thought of the map, the cursed piece of paper in my pocket. I yanked it out, my fingers trembling so badly I almost tore it. I wanted to burn it. I wanted to rip it into 1,000 pieces and flush it away. But I couldn't. Instead, I walked to the cheap particle board desk in the corner, pulled open the top drawer, and threw it inside. I slammed the drawer shut. It was a flimsy prison, but it was the best I could do. Out of sight. I didn't want to see it again. I needed to pretend it didn't exist. To drown out the silence, I turned on the television. I flicked through channels, not watching anything. The bright, meaningless images and cheerful voices were just noise, a barrier against the shrieking memory of the swing and the sight of that handwriting. My handwriting. I sank into the lumpy couch, pulling my knees to my chest. Hours passed. The sun went down. The blue light of the TV flickered across the walls of my small living room, painting shifting shadows in the corners. I must have dozed off. The phone ringing sliced through the manufactured calm. It was a shrill, violent sound in the quiet room. I jumped, my heart lurching into my throat. I looked at the coffee table. My cell was vibrating, the screen a bright, insistent rectangle. A number I didn't recognize. Blocked caller ID. My first instinct was to ignore it. Let it go to voicemail. But the thought of it ringing and ringing was worse. I snatched it up, my thumb hovering over the green icon. Maybe it was the pharmacy. Or a wrong number. I swiped to answer. Hello? My voice was rough from disuse. The other end was not silent. It was filled with a low hiss, a crackle like a bad radio signal. Beneath the static there was another sound. A soft, constant, liquid noise. The sound of water flowing. Not a faucet, but something wider, more open. A stream, maybe. Or a river. Hello? Who is this? I asked, my voice louder now, tinged with irritation. Only the static and the water answered. A cold prickle moved up my neck. I listened for another 10 seconds, the sound of the running water seeming to fill my apartment, to seep into the walls. It was methodical, unchanging. Then, with a curse, I stabbed the end call button and tossed the phone onto the cushion beside me. Just a spam call. A new kind of robocall, maybe. That's all it was. It had to be. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, a crick in my neck, and the TV screen displaying a colorful, static pattern. I felt hungover, though I hadn't had a drop to drink. The memory of the phone call felt distant, stupid. I got up, made coffee in the cracked white mug, and tried to fall into a routine. Check emails, read the news, anything to feel normal. My phone buzzed on the counter, a text message. I picked it up, expecting a notification from my bank. But the message was from the same blocked number as the night before. My stomach tightened. It wasn't a notification. It was a picture message. My thumb trembled as I opened it. The image resolved on the screen. It was a photograph, taken in low light. A concrete wall, stained and streaked with moisture. On the wall was a chaotic spray of graffiti, layers of old tags painted over with new ones. The photo was tightly framed, focusing on one specific piece of art. A crudely sprayed black crown, dripping paint like tears. The whole scene was enclosed by the oppressive, curved ceiling of an underpass. A bridge. I stared at the picture, at the black crown. A flicker. Not of memory, but of the same sickening recognition I'd felt in the park. My body moved on its own. I walked to the desk, pulled the drawer open with a sharp jerk, and took out the map. My eyes scanned the shaky ink. There it was, the second X. It was situated under a series of parallel lines meant to represent a road, and next to it, scrawled in that same hateful handwriting, were two words: Echo Bridge. The sound from the phone call came rushing back, the hiss of static, and the water, the constant flowing water, the sound you would hear standing under a bridge. It all clicked into place, a piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. This wasn't a coincidence. It was an invitation. A summons. The cold feeling in my gut was no longer just a feeling. It was a certainty. Someone was playing a game with me, and I was the only other player. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a dark, pulling curiosity. I had to go. I had to know. I drove. The address for Echo Bridge was easy enough to find online. A forgotten piece of infrastructure on the industrial edge of town, connecting two sides of a mostly dry canal. Parking my car on the gravel shoulder, I could see the entrance to the underpass. It was a dark, gaping mouth of concrete. The air here was heavy, with the smell of damp earth and decay. I got out of the car, the crunch of my shoes on the gravel sounding unnaturally loud. I walked toward the entrance. The sunlight didn't penetrate more than a few feet inside. Stepping into the underpass was like stepping into another world. The temperature dropped instantly. The air was thick, wet. A constant, slow dripping sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness ahead. Drip, drip, drip. My footsteps made a flat, slapping sound on the wet pavement, each one bouncing off the curved walls and coming back to me, slightly distorted. It sounded like someone else was walking just behind me, perfectly in sync. I pulled out my phone for a flashlight. The screen lit up my face, then displayed a single, frustrating message. No signal. Of course. I put it away and continued deeper into the gloom. The faint light from the far end was my only guide. It seemed 100 yards away. Then I heard other sounds. A whisper, so faint I thought it was the wind whistling through the concrete structure. I stopped, straining my ears. The dripping continued. My own breathing was a harsh sound in my chest. Then, another noise. A scrape. The sound of metal being dragged slowly across concrete. It was distant, coming from the blackness ahead of me. It stopped. I stood frozen, my muscles locked tight. Who's there? I called out. My own voice echoed back at me, hollow and small. Who's there? Who's there? There. Silence answered. I took a few more hesitant steps. The graffiti from the picture was on my right. There it was. The black, weeping crown. It looked darker in person, almost wet. As I stared at it, the whispering started again. This time it was closer. Not just one voice, but several, layered over each other, a soft chorus of indecipherable words. A chill crawled over my skin, raising goosebumps on my arms. This place was wrong. I needed to leave. Now. I turned around. The entrance, the bright slash of daylight I'd walked through just a minute ago, seemed smaller, farther away. It was an optical illusion. It had to be, but my heart started hammering against my ribs. As I watched, a shadow, impossibly fast and dark, flitted across the opening, momentarily blotting out the light. It was gone in an instant. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They started to resolve into a single phrase, repeated over and over by the layered voices. A name. Anna. Where's Anna? What did you do to Anna? The name meant nothing to me, but the accusation in the tone, the cold, spectral anger, sent a jolt of pure animal fear through me. I didn't wait for another question. I ran. My feet slipped on the slick concrete. I scrambled for the distant light of the entrance. It didn't seem to be getting any closer. What did you do? What did you do to her? Anna? The voices were all around me now, coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the ground beneath my feet. I gasped for air, a sob catching in my throat. I was almost there. 10 more yards. A sharp whistle cut the air. A gray blur fell from the ceiling above. It slammed into the pavement directly in front of me with a deafening crack. A piece of concrete the size of my head. Shards of it peppered my shins. I yelled, throwing myself backward, landing hard on my hands and hip. The impact sent a shockwave of pain up my arm. I stared at the broken piece of rubble, then scrambled to look up at the bridge deck above the underpass. There was nothing there. Just the empty, gray sky framed by the edge of the road. No person, no car, nothing. Then I heard it. A laugh. It wasn't the childish giggle from the park. This was low and dry. A humorless chuckle of contempt, and it was close. So close. I frantically looked around, my eyes darting into the shadows. But there was no one. The sound hadn't come from the darkness. A terrible realization bloomed in my chest. I had felt it. A vibration. A resonance in my own ribcage. The laugh had come from inside of me. I didn't scream. I just crawled. I crab-walked backward, away from the fallen concrete, away from the graffiti, my eyes wide with a terror that went beyond fear of another person. When my back hit the sunlit ground outside the underpass, I scrambled to my feet and ran back to my car, not stopping until the door was shut and the lock was clicked down. I sat there, hyperventilating, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the echo of that laugh still vibrating in my bones. After my breathing returned to something resembling normal, I reached for my phone, my hands still unsteady. I had to call someone. The police? What would I say? That a bridge whispered to me? That I was laughing at myself? The screen lit up. I had signal again. There were no missed calls. No new texts. But one of the app icons was displayed differently. The voice recorder. It was open. And on the screen, there was a new file. Recording_001. Duration 007. Created 5 minutes ago. My blood turned to ice water. My finger moved with a will of its own, hovering over the play button. I had to know. I pressed it. The speakers on my phone crackled to life. A voice filled the small space of the car. It was my voice. My pitch, my timbre. But the tone was all wrong. It was flat, cold, devoid of any feeling except a chilling, patient cruelty. It spoke with a confidence I had never possessed. You'll remember soon, my own voice whispered from the phone. You and I will remember soon. Sleep did not come. The recording played on a loop behind my eyes. A venomous whisper in my own voice. You'll remember soon. It was a promise. It was a threat. The thin blanket on the couch offered no warmth. Every creak of the building settling, every groan of the ancient refrigerator in the kitchen, was a footstep in the hall. Sometime before dawn I made a decision. It was a small act of defiance, a desperate attempt to sever the string that was pulling me apart. I got up. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I walked to the desk, pulled open the drawer, and took out the map. I didn't look at it. I didn't want to see the scrawled X's or the hateful handwriting. I carried it to the kitchen and shoved it deep into the trash can, underneath coffee grounds and an empty milk carton. I did the same with the piece of paper from the park, the one with the words so lovely on it. I buried them. I wanted them gone. I wanted to wake up and have this all be a bad dream, a fever that had broken in the night. The next morning, I woke on the couch again, neck stiff, the taste of rust in my mouth. For a moment, the apartment was just an apartment. Sunlight streamed through the dirty window, cutting a dusty yellow rectangle on the worn rug. Normal. I clung to that feeling. I made coffee. I would go to work. I would do normal things. I would not think about bridges or parks or voices on a phone. My car keys weren't on the hook by the door. I patted my jeans from the day before. Nothing. I checked the coffee table, overturning a stack of mail. I looked on the kitchen counter, next to the buzzing phone I refused to look at. My pulse began to climb. A low, steady drumbeat of irritation. I checked my pockets again. I ran my hands over the couch cushions. Nothing. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, but it felt like the first crack in the wall I was trying to build. Come on, I mumbled, my voice rough. I checked the desk, the bathroom counter. I looked inside the refrigerator without thinking. The frustration was curdling into something else. Something colder. I walked back toward the living room and stopped. I was an idiot. I must have left them in my bedroom. I hadn't slept in there, but maybe I'd tossed them on the nightstand yesterday. I walked to the bedroom door and reached for the knob. My fingers brushed against them. The keys. They were hanging from the knob. On the outside. A chill, slick and oily, moved down my spine. I stared at the brass keys hanging from the brass knob. I had slept on the couch, just a few feet away. The living room and the short hall to the bedroom were one continuous space. For the keys to be here, someone would have had to walk past me while I slept, hang them on the door, and walk back out. I told myself I'd done it. I must have. In my distracted state yesterday afternoon, I must have hung them there and forgotten completely. It was the only explanation that let me keep breathing. I snatched the keys, the metal cold against my palm, and walked out the front door without looking back. The parking lot was mostly empty. My car sat alone in the far corner where I always parked it. The morning air was sharp. I walked toward it, the crunch of my shoes on the pavement the only sound. Then I saw it. A small white square tucked under the driver's side windshield wiper. My blood went cold. I stopped 5 feet from the car. It was a trick of the light. It was a flyer for a pizza place. It was anything but what I knew it was. I forced my legs to move. I walked to the driver's side door and looked at the piece of paper. It wasn't a flyer. It was a piece of the map. Torn, not cut. The edges were ragged. My hands shook as I pulled it from under the black rubber of the wiper blade. The paper was the same cheap, thin stock. The ink was the same shaky, aggressive hand. There was no landmark on this piece, no clever drawing. Just a single, stark X and below it, 2 words. Warehouse 7. The map I had thrown in the trash. A piece of it was here. It wasn't just a map anymore, it wasn't a clue. It was a leash. Something was not just showing me the way, it was pulling me. The feeling of being watched intensified. No longer a prickle on my neck, but a heavy weight on my shoulders. I looked around the empty parking lot. At the silent windows of the apartment building. There was no one. There was never anyone. This was a game, and I was being moved across the board whether I wanted to play or not. The thought of driving away, of ignoring it, was impossible. What would I find next? A piece of it on my pillow? In my hand when I woke up? A strange, dark certainty settled in my gut. I had to go. I had to see the next square on the board. Finding Warehouse 7 was not difficult. A quick search online pointed me to a derelict industrial sector on the south side of town, a skeleton of forgotten industry. Rust-streaked factories with broken windows stared out like vacant eyes over fields of weeds and cracked asphalt. I parked on what was once a road, now just a path of rubble. Warehouse 7 was the largest building, a hulking box of corrugated metal and crumbling brick. The large roll-up door was shut tight, but a smaller man-sized door on the side was slightly ajar, a dark slice in the rusty red wall. The air smelled of wet metal and rot. I got out of the car. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. I pushed the small door. It scraped open with a long, groaning complaint of rusted hinges. I stepped inside. The temperature plunged. The light from the open door barely penetrated the gloom. The air was thick and tasted of decay. I pulled out my phone, the screen's light a weak weapon against the oppressive dark. I switched on the flashlight. The beam cut a sharp white cone through the black, illuminating a long, narrow corridor flanked by high shelves piled with rotting cardboard boxes and machine parts shrouded in thick cobwebs. I walked. My footsteps echoed, a flat slap on the concrete floor. The beam of my light danced ahead, picking out details. A smear of old oil on the ground. A dead rat, stiff and gray. The corridor seemed to lead to a larger, open space deep inside. I kept walking, the silence pressing in on me, broken only by a slow, methodical dripping sound from somewhere above. Drip, drip, drip. I reached the end of the corridor. It opened into a vast, cavernous space. My light couldn't find the walls. I swept it around, seeing only more shelves, more junk, disappearing into the darkness. There was nothing here. No graffiti. No clues. Just rot and silence. A wave of profound foolishness washed over me. I was chasing ghosts in a dead building. I had let myself be terrorized by a prank. I turned to go back. A wall of old, grimy brick stood where the corridor had been. My heart stopped. I swung the flashlight beam wildly. Left. Right. Nothing. Just the solid, unbroken wall of the warehouse. The shelves were gone. The long, narrow path was gone. I took a step back, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. I had just walked through here. It was impossible. I must have gotten turned around in the main space. I must have. I spun around, my light cutting frantic arcs through the dark. I ran a few yards in the other direction, hitting another wall. The space felt smaller now. The high ceiling seemed lower. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow. It was a trick. I was panicking. Clang Gu-Ji. The sound was immense, final. It came from the direction I'd entered. The sound of the heavy metal door being slammed shut. I was locked in. The sound echoed for a long time, bouncing off the walls that were suddenly all too close. The space wasn't just small, it was shrinking. My light caught something, a shape, under a grimy canvas tarp in what felt like the center of the room. I walked toward it, my legs unsteady. I needed to find something. Anything. A tool. A window. An explanation. I pulled the tarp off. It fell to the floor with a soft, heavy whump, kicking up a cloud of dust that choked me. It was a mirror. A huge, ornate thing, at least 7 feet tall, its frame carved with leaves and flowers, all of it covered in a thick layer of gray filth. It didn't belong here. It was from a house, a mansion maybe. I stared at my own vague, distorted shape in its dusty surface, acting on some instinct I didn't understand. I reached out and wiped a clean streak across the glass with the sleeve of my jacket. I saw my face. Strained, pale, frightened. I looked like myself. But as I watched, something shifted. The eyes in the reflection changed. They hardened. The fear in them was replaced by a cold, sharp intelligence. The corner of the mouth, my mouth, in the reflection, curled upward. It was not a smile. It was a sneer of absolute contempt. I stood frozen, my hand still resting on the glass. The man in the mirror was me, but it was not me. He looked directly into my eyes. His expression was one of cruel amusement. He knew something I didn't. He was in on a joke, and I was the punchline. Then, he raised his hand, his reflection's hand. He pressed his fingertips against the glass. From the other side, tap, tap, tap. The sound was dry and clear. A faint pressure vibrated against my own fingers, still on the glass. I screamed. It was a raw, mindless sound. I threw myself backward, tripping over my own feet, landing hard on the concrete floor. The impact shot up my spine. From the ground, I watched as a network of cracks spread across the mirror's surface, originating from where I had touched it. They splintered outward like a spiderweb, but the image behind the cracks remained. The other me. His sneer widened into a full, horrifying grin. He was laughing at me. Silently. I crawled away, sobbing for breath. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly into the darkness, my hands outstretched. I collided with a wall, the rough bricks scraping my palms. I followed it, running my hand along the surface, desperate. My fingers found a splintered wooden edge. A door. It was boarded up. I threw my shoulder against it. Pain flared, but the wood groaned. I hit it again. And again. On the 4th try, a board splintered and broke. I kicked at the hole, making it larger, then squeezed my way through the ragged opening, splinters tearing at my clothes and skin. I fell out into the afternoon light, landing on a patch of weeds and gravel. I gasped in the fresh air, my lungs burning. For a long moment I just lay there, my body shaking. When I finally found the strength to push myself up, I looked back at the monstrous red building. I saw him. In a grimy, broken window on the 2nd floor. A shadow. A figure. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. It had my build, my height, my shape. As I stared, paralyzed, the figure moved. It slowly, deliberately raised its arm. In its hand, it held a sledgehammer, the heavy cast-iron head glinting once in the weak sunlight. It wasn't swinging it. It wasn't threatening me. It was just holding it up for me to see. A tool. A statement. Then, it turned with a slow, calm motion and disappeared back into the darkness of the warehouse. I was on the gravel before I knew I was moving. My hands scraped against stone and dirt as I pushed myself up. My car. The key was in my pocket. The ignition was a destination. I ran, not looking back at the red building, at the dark window. The image of the figure was burned behind my eyes. The shape of it, the sledgehammer it held. I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbled the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a comforting roar. I slammed the shifter into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires screamed on the loose pavement. I drove. I didn't know where I was going, only that it was away. Away from the warehouses, away from the silent figure, away from the reflection in the mirror. The city blurred past. Traffic lights were green flashes, red glows I blew through without a second thought. My breath came in ragged bursts. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I drove until the industrial sector gave way to suburbs, then to the glowing artery of a highway. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows. My body was a coiled spring of fear. My mind a blank screen playing the same scene on a loop. A grimy window. A silhouette. A raised hammer. After an hour, or maybe two, the adrenaline began to ebb away, leaving a hollow, trembling exhaustion in its place. I needed to stop. My hands were shaking too badly to grip the wheel properly. I saw the bright, greasy promise of a 24-hour diner off the next exit and pulled in. The parking lot was nearly empty. I switched off the engine and the silence rushed in, deep and unnerving. For a full minute I just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. Inside, the diner smelled of old coffee and bleach. A waitress with tired eyes pointed me to a booth. I slid onto the cracked vinyl seat. The warmth of the room felt strange against my chilled skin. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. I nodded. I couldn't form words. She returned and filled a thick ceramic mug. I wrapped my hands around it, trying to steal its warmth, trying to stop them from shaking. I stared down into the black liquid. My own distorted face stared back. Pale, eyes wide. I looked away. I tried to drink, but my hand trembled so violently that hot coffee sloshed over the rim, spilling across the table. It pooled around the base of a metal napkin dispenser. "Shit," I muttered, the first word I'd spoken since falling out of the warehouse. I grabbed a fistful of thin paper napkins and began to mop up the mess. I lifted the napkin dispenser to wipe underneath it. It had been sitting on top of a paper coaster. I picked up the damp coaster to throw it away. My eyes caught the logo printed in faded blue ink. It was a simple, cartoonish sun rising over a hill. Underneath it, in a cheap script font, were the words, "Sunrise Inn. A clean bed for a fair price." The name hit me with a physical jolt, like a low-voltage shock. Sunrise Inn. It was familiar. Not a memory, not an image, but a feeling. A deep, unsettling resonance in the back of my mind, like a word on the tip of the tongue that you can't quite grasp. I dropped the coaster back on the table as if it were hot. The coffee I had spilled on it looked like old blood. I threw a $10 bill on the tabletop and walked out, leaving the full mug behind. Back in the car, I sat in the driver's seat, the darkness of the parking lot a shield. The sledgehammer. The figure in the window wasn't just a random threat, it was a message, a symbol. My mind raced. Tools. I kept a small toolkit in the trunk. Basic things. A lug wrench, jumper cables, a hammer. I got out of the car. The air was cold now. I walked to the back of the vehicle. My heart was a heavy, irregular thud in my chest. I put the key in the trunk lock. It turned with a dry click. I lifted the trunk lid. It groaned open. The familiar smell of rubber and oil filled the air. There was the spare tire, the folded blanket, the red plastic box of my toolkit. And next to it, lying on the gray felt liner, was a sledgehammer. Long, wooden handle. Heavy, cast iron head. It was the one. I knew it instantly. It was not a tool I owned. I had never bought a sledgehammer in my life. I reached out, my fingers hesitating just an inch above the worn wood. There was a dark, reddish-brown smear on the handle, right where a hand would grip it. It was flaky and dull. I didn't touch it. My gaze moved past the hammer. Beside it, almost hidden in the shadow of the trunk's lip, was something else. A key. An old-fashioned metal key, attached to a large, diamond-shaped piece of faded red plastic. I picked it up. The plastic was worn smooth at the edges. Embossed on its surface was the same logo from the coaster, the smiling sun. Below it, in raised white numbers, was the number 13. It wasn't a map anymore. It wasn't a game of clues. This was different. This was possession. The things in my life, the space I occupied, were not fully my own. I had no memory of putting a sledgehammer in my trunk. I had no memory of this key. But they were here. A force, invisible and patient, was not just guiding me. It was placing the tools in my hand. I slammed the trunk shut. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet lot. There was no choice. To go home would be to wait for the next piece of this puzzle to appear on my pillow. To drive away would be to run from my own shadow. I got back in the car, the plastic key fob cold and solid in my palm. I started the engine. I knew where I had to go. The Sunrise Inn was 20 miles down the highway, tucked behind a gas station that had long since been boarded up. Its sign did not flicker. Half the neon tubes were simply dead, spelling out a fractured promise of rest. The building was a long, two-story block of faded yellow stucco, streaks of rust weeping from the railings on the second-floor walkway. It was a place for people with no other options. I parked the car and got out. I didn't go to the office. I didn't need to. I climbed the exterior concrete stairs to the second floor. The metal railing was loose under my hand. Room 9. Room 11. Room 13. The door was a faded, peeling red, the number 13 painted on it in flaking black paint. It looked like any other door, but it felt like the end of a path. I held up the key. My hand was steady now. The fear had burned away into a cold, hard resolve. I had to see what was on the other side. The key slid into the lock. It was a perfect fit. I turned it. The mechanism inside gave a loud, satisfying back quote. Clunk, back quote. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. I closed the door behind me. It settled into its frame with a solid, heavy back quote thud back quote. The sound of a stone sealing a crypt. The air in the room was thick. It smelled of mildew, stale cigarette smoke, and something else, a sweet, cloying odor of decay. It was a smell I recognized from the warehouse. My eyes adjusted to the gloom. A single window was covered by a thick blackout curtain. The only light came from the gap under the door. The room was almost bare. A double bed with a thin, stained bedspread was pushed against one wall. In the corner, Hantai, an old, boxy television sat on a cheap, particle board stand. On top of the television, next to a layer of dust, was a VCR. The blinking back quote 12 o'clock back quote on its display was the only sign of life in the room. My gaze was drawn to the top of the VCR. Something was there. A black cassette tape. A white label was stuck to its spine. On the label, in the same aggressive, shaky handwriting from the map, were two words. Watch this. My legs felt weak. I moved toward the television set. My movements were slow, automatic. My hand reached out and picked up the tape. The plastic felt light, hollow. I pushed the power button on the VCR. The display brightened. I pushed the eject button. The carriage door slowly opened with a whirring sound. I slid the tape in. The carriage closed, pulling the film into its guts. I pressed play. The television screen flickered, then resolved into a field of blue. Then, an image appeared. It was grainy, the colors washed out. It was a video. And it was shot from a first-person point of view. The camera was shaky, as if held by someone walking. It panned slowly across a room with a thin, stained bedspread. A room with a single window covered by a blackout curtain. A room with a faded red door. It was this room. I was watching a recording of the exact space I was standing in. The person holding the camera was breathing. The microphone picked it up clearly. A deep, heavy sound. A wet sound, in and out. In and out. It was a familiar rhythm. The camera stopped panning. It focused on a wooden chair in the center of the room. A chair that wasn't here now. A woman was tied to it. Her eyes were wide with a terror that transcended the screen's poor quality. Her mouth was sealed with a wide strip of silver duct tape. Her muffled cries were barely audible over the sound of the heavy breathing. The cameraman didn't speak. He just stood there, breathing. That heavy, labored sound. In. Out. Then, an object entered the frame from the bottom right. long, wooden. It was raised up until a heavy block of dark metal filled the top of the screen, eclipsing the woman's face. A sledgehammer. The screen went black. The VCR whirred and spat the tape out. I stood there in the silent, dark room. The backquote 12 o'clock backquote on the VCR blinked its steady, stupid pulse. I didn't rewind the tape to see the woman. I didn't rewind it to see the hammer. I pushed it back in and hit play, my thumb pressing down hard on the button. The blue screen. The shaky view of the room. And then, the sound. H H H H H H H H H H H H H H H H H H H. The breathing. That deep, wet, rhythmic sound. It filled the small room. I put my own hand on my chest. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to control my own breath, which was coming in short, panicked gasps. I forced myself to slow down. I drew in a long, shaky breath. I let it out. Inhale. Exhale. I listened to myself. I listened to the tape. The rhythm. The cadence. The thick, wet quality of the sound. They were the same. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a solid thing. My first coherent thought was to destroy the tape. I lunged forward, my hand slapping the eject button. The plastic carriage whirred open. I snatched the cassette out. I was going to snap it, grind the film under my heel. But I stopped. My hands wouldn't do it. It felt like evidence. It felt like the only proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I threw the tape on the stained bedspread and ran. My feet hammered on the metal walkway outside the room, the sound echoing in the dead night air. I didn't look back at the peeled red paint of room 13. I took the concrete stairs 2 at a time, my hands slipping on the rusty railing. The violent jolt in my shoulder was a distant fact. I hit the gravel of the parking lot and sprinted to my car. The key was in the ignition before the door was fully closed. The engine roared to life. I wrenched the gear shift into reverse, tires spitting rocks and fishtailed out of the parking space. I drove away from the Sunrise Inn, the fractured neon sign shrinking in my rearview mirror, until it was just another smear of light in the darkness. The highway was a black ribbon. I kept the speedometer needle pressed against 80, then 90. I needed to go home. The word itself was a prayer. Home. A place that was mine. A place that was safe. The drive was a blur of high beams and the hypnotic thump-thump of the tires on the pavement. I didn't turn on the radio. The heavy, wet sound of the breathing on the tape was still playing on a loop inside my head. H, 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 H. H, 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 H. In. Out. My apartment building was a brick fortress under the orange glow of the city sky. I parked in my assigned spot, killed the engine, and sat for a moment. My hands were shaking again, a tremor that started deep in my bones. I got out. The cool night air felt good on my face. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, my footsteps loud in the stairwell. I fumbled with my keys at the door, the metal clinking. The lock turned. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing I did was hit the light switch in the entryway. A flood of warm, yellow light filled the small space. It wasn't enough. I moved through the apartment, my hands slapping every switch I passed. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, the bathroom, the bedroom. I turned on every single lamp, every overhead fixture, until the place was blazing with light, shadows banished to the tightest corners under the furniture. There were no dark windows here. My blinds were drawn. I locked the deadbolt. I slid the chain lock into its groove. A solid click. A metallic scrape. Safe. I sank onto my sofa. The fabric was familiar against my back. I grabbed the remote from the coffee table. My thumb found the power button. The television came on, the volume too loud. Some late-night comedy show. A man was telling a joke. An audience laughed. It was noise. It was normal. I forced myself to watch. The man on the screen smiled. The audience clapped. It meant nothing. My body was a knot of tension. I sat hunched forward, my arms wrapped around myself. I tried to focus on the comedian's words, on the bright colors of the set. My gaze kept drifting. It slid past the television I was watching and into the bedroom. The door was open. From my position on the sofa, I could see the dark screen of the smaller TV on my dresser. It was off. A black, reflective square. In it I could see a distorted image of the living room. A miniature version of the scene. I could see the lamp on the end table. I could see the corner of a picture frame on the wall. And I could see a small, hunched figure sitting on a sofa. Me. A man trying to hide from the dark by drowning himself in light. My back pocket vibrated. The sudden buzz against my skin made me jolt, a gasp escaping my lips. It vibrated again. A text message. My phone. I had forgotten it was there. My hands were clumsy as I pulled it out. The screen was a web of cracks from where I'd thrown it against the wall in the motel room, but it was still on. A notification sat on the lock screen. A new message from the same unknown number. I slid my thumb across the screen to open it. The words were simple. 4 of them. Did you enjoy the show? A wave of nausea rolled through me. I didn't throw the phone this time. I let it slip from my fingers. It hit the rug with a soft thud. I stared at it, at the glowing question on its shattered face. The laughter from the TV show felt like a personal insult. Then it stopped. The comedian's voice cut off mid-sentence. The sound of the audience vanished. The screen went black for a second, then flickered back to life. It was no longer the comedy show. Now it was an old movie, black and white. A man in a trench coat and a fedora was standing under a street lamp. Rain slicked the pavement. The picture quality was poor, full of scratches and grain. He was talking to a woman, but there was no sound. Then, the man turned his head. He looked away from the woman. He looked directly into the camera. Directly at me. His mouth opened. The audio crackled on, not the movie's soundtrack, but a clear, close voice that came from the TV speakers. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but it spoke my name. It's time to face the truth, Leo. I scrambled backward on the sofa, pushing myself away from the television. The man on the screen held his gaze for a second longer, a placid, knowing look, then turned back to the woman. The movie continued. Silent again. What happened next wasn't a sequence. It was an explosion. The television screen began to flash, cycling through channels at an impossible speed. A news report. A cartoon. A nature documentary showing a lion tearing into a gazelle. A commercial for soap. The images assaulted my eyes. A strobe effect of violence and mundanity. At the same time, the radio in the kitchen clicked on by itself, blasting static at full volume. A high-pitched, tooth-rattling shriek. The lights in the apartment began to flicker. On, off, on, off. The entire room strobed in time with the flashing TV, turning my movements into a series of jerky, frozen tableaus. Over the static, something else emerged. A voice. A scream, distorted and stretched, looped over and over. It sounded like the woman from the videotape. I had to make it stop. I launched myself off the sofa and lunged for the wall socket behind the entertainment center. I grabbed the TV's power cord and ripped it from the outlet. The screen stayed on. The channels kept flashing. The audio kept blaring. Panic clawed its way up my throat. I had to get out. I ran for the front door, my feet slipping on the rug. The chain. The deadbolt. I fumbled with the chain, sliding it free. I twisted the knob on the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. I put my other hand on the doorknob to get more leverage. A searing heat shot up my arm. Fuck! I snatched my hand back. A sharp cry of pain punched out of me. The metal of the doorknob was glowing a faint, dull red, like an electric stove element. The skin on my palm and fingers was scorched white. The smell of burned flesh hit my nostrils. I stumbled back, cradling my hand to my chest, and through the noise, through the static and the flickering lights and the screaming, a new sound began. It came from the floor. From the cracked screen of my phone, it was a low, chuckling laugh. The same sound from the warehouse. A deep, familiar sound. It grew louder, more confident. A dry, rasping sound that cut through all the other chaos. Then, as suddenly as it began, it all stopped. The TV channels stopped cycling. The radio fell silent. The lights stopped flickering, remaining on, steady and bright. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged sawing of my own breath. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. My eyes were drawn to the bedroom. The TV on my dresser, the one that had been off, was now on. The screen glowed with a pale bluish light. It wasn't showing a movie, it was showing a room. A bedroom. My bedroom. The angle was high, from the corner near the ceiling where the two walls met. It was security camera footage. I had never installed a security camera in my life. The footage was date-stamped in the bottom corner. Last night. The video showed me. I was in bed, sleeping. Just a lump under the covers, one arm thrown out. The room was dark, but the camera's night vision rendered everything in ghostly shades of green and gray. For a long time, nothing happened. Just the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of my own breathing body. Then, from the darkest corner of the room, the one by the closet that the light from the hallway never quite reached, something moved. A figure detached itself from the shadows. It didn't step out. It just congealed. It took shape. The shape was mine. The height, the build, the set of the shoulders. It was wearing my clothes. The dark t-shirt and jeans I'd worn to bed. It moved without a sound. It walked to the side of the bed and stood there, looking down at my sleeping form. The figure watched me for what felt like an eternity. Its face was a blur of pixels in the low-resolution video, impossible to make out. But I didn't need to see its face. I knew its posture. I knew its stillness. After a moment, the figure on the screen turned away from the bed and walked silently to the bedroom door. It paused. It reached out, not for the knob, but for the top of the doorframe. Then it moved out into the hall, toward the apartment's front door, the camera's view following it. It reached the front door. It didn't open it. It carefully, deliberately, placed my car keys on the exterior handle of the peephole. A glint of metal in the green-tinged darkness. Then it turned and walked back. Not to the bed. It walked back toward the camera, back toward the corner by the closet. It didn't look up. It just kept walking until it was directly underneath the camera's vantage point, and then it stepped back into the deepest part of the shadow and simply dissolved. It was there, and then it was gone. The footage looped. I saw my sleeping form. I saw the figure emerge. I saw it place the keys. I saw it retreat. Over and over, the screen went black. For a full minute I did not move. I just stood in the center of my brightly lit living room, my burned hand throbbing, my mind a blank slate. The only thing in the universe was the black, reflective screen of the television in my bedroom and the hum of electricity in the walls. My own reflection stared back at me from the dark screen. Pale face, wide eyes, a stranger. And behind my reflection, on the wall behind where I was standing, there was something that hadn't been there before. Written in thick, white chalk strokes across the beige paint of my living room wall were 4 words. The letters were crude, aggressive, shaky. The same handwriting from the map. The same handwriting from the label on the videotape. I hadn't heard a single sound, not the scrape of chalk on drywall, not a footstep, nothing. The words were a statement, a fact, a promise. I am always here. The chalk dust was on my fingers. I looked from the wall to my hand, then back to the wall. The white letters were stark against the beige paint. I hadn't heard a thing, no scrape, no footstep, just the low hum of the refrigerator. The words felt loud. They screamed from the wall in total silence. I am always here. My burned palm throbbed in time with the pounding in my skull, a dull, insistent beat. The smell of my own cooked skin was faint in the air. I stumbled backward, away from the wall, my good hand clutching my injured one to my chest. Every light in the apartment was still on, a sterile, useless glare. The safety I had frantically built piece by piece, the locked door, the chain, the banished shadows, had been dismantled from the inside. The fortress was a fishbowl. My phone lay on the rug, a dark rectangle, the source of the laugh. My keys were on the floor by the door, where I had dropped them after trying the burning knob. I didn't pick them up. I moved toward the kitchen, my feet leaden. I needed water. My throat was sand. I twisted the faucet and drank straight from the tap, the cold water a shock against my teeth. I drank until my stomach hurt. There was only one place to go. One person who was supposed to have the answers. A name and a face that represented logic, order, a way out of the fog. Dr. Miles. The psychiatrist the hospital had assigned to me after the accident. The man who was supposed to help me put the pieces back together. I grabbed my keys. I didn't turn off the lights. I didn't look at the wall again. I walked out of the apartment, leaving the door unlocked behind me, and clattered down the 3 flights of stairs. The night air was cool, but I was sweating. My car started on the first try. The drive through the sleeping city was a smear of orange streetlights and dark storefronts. I didn't speed. I drove with a rigid, careful posture, both hands on the wheel, my burned one leaving a faint, damp print on the leather. My mind was a loop of 4 chalk words. Dr. Miles's clinic was in a modern glass and steel building downtown. The lights were on in his corner office on the 7th floor. A cleaning crew, maybe. Or maybe he worked late. I parked in the deserted garage underneath, the squeal of my tires echoing in the concrete emptiness. I took the elevator up. The chime as the doors opened on the 7th floor was sharp. The hallway was carpeted, silent. His office suite was at the end of the hall. The glass door was etched with his name. Drive Alan Miles, MD, Psychiatry. Underneath that, a single word. Clarity. The door was unlocked. A sliver of relief, sharp and painful, pierced through my fear. He was here. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The waiting room was empty, the chairs neatly arranged. The magazines fanned out perfectly on a low glass table. The air smelled clean, a faint citrus scent. It was a space of utter control. A deep hum came from the vents. I walked past the dark receptionist's desk and toward the light spilling from a partially open door down a short corridor. His office. I tapped lightly on the doorframe. Dr. Miles? Leo, come in. His voice was calm, a deep and steady sound that had anchored me for months. I pushed the door open. He was sitting behind his large mahogany desk. Not in his usual chair, but perched on the edge. He wore a crisp blue shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. The lamp on his desk cast a warm pool of light over him, leaving the rest of the room in soft shadows. He wasn't looking at papers, he was just sitting there, waiting, as if he knew I was coming. The door was open, I said. My voice was a croak. I know. I thought you might need it to be. Sit down. He gestured to the leather chair opposite his desk, the one I always sat in. It looked like a safe harbor. I crossed the room and sank into it. The cool leather felt solid against my back. I'm sorry to come here so late, I began, the words tumbling out. I didn't know what to do. I think I'm losing my mind. The motel. There was a tape. It was me, but it wasn't me. And my apartment. I stopped. I couldn't form the words. I just held up my burned hand. The skin was tight and white across the palm and fingers. A web of angry red surrounded the worst of it. Dr. Miles leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He looked at my hand, his expression one of professional concern. He didn't seem shocked. He just nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. I told him everything. The map, the warehouse, the motel room, the videotape, the phone, the television, the doorknob, the chalk on the wall. The story spilled out of me, a chaotic, desperate confession. I was pleading with him to tell me it was a breakdown, a psychotic episode, something that could be fixed with pills and time. Anything but the truth. He listened without interruption. His gaze never left my face. The hum of the building's climate control was the only other sound. When I was finished, panting slightly, the silence in the room felt heavy. He leaned back, a small, considered motion. These are powerful sensory hallucinations, Leo, he said, his voice measured and reassuring. Intrusions. It's a textbook response to severe PTSD. Your mind is trying to process a trauma it can't remember, so it's creating a narrative. A monster. It's a way to give your fear a face. I felt a wave of dizziness. It sounded so reasonable, so clinical. The tape, I whispered. The writing on the wall. My hand. Your mind is a formidable thing, he said. It can manifest physical symptoms. It can create convincing illusions. The important thing is that we're here, now, in a safe place. We can work through this. He gave me a small, encouraging smile. And then he added, You know, this reminds me of our session last week. Do you remember what you told me about the warehouse? I blinked. Last week? Yes. You described it. The broken windows. The dust. You said you liked the smell of rust. You said it smelled like old blood. Like home. A cold wire was pulled taut in my gut. I stared at him. The air seemed to thin. I had never told him about the warehouse. Not a word. I had only found the map, found that place, 2 days ago. My first coherent thought was that I had misremembered. The days were blurring together. The trauma, the lack of sleep. I don't remember saying that, I managed. Dr. Miles's smile didn't waver. It was a fixed, placid thing. Memory is a tricky landscape, Leo. Full of holes, full of tricks. He tilted his head, a gesture of idle curiosity. The paintings on the wall behind him, abstract swirls of red and black, suddenly looked less like art and more like crime scene photos. Rorschach blots of old violence. We need to identify the source of this other personality. This storm that you feel is taking over. It's a good name. Very evocative. Where did you come up with it? Remember? The hum from the vents seemed to get louder. It was a high, keening sound that vibrated behind my eyes. Storm. He said the name. A name I had screamed into a shattered mirror in a gas station bathroom. A name I had never spoken to another living soul. The blood drained from my face. I could feel it go, leaving my skin cold and clammy. The chair was no longer a safe harbor. It was an interrogation seat. The room was no longer an office. It was a box. The trap wasn't in the derelict corners of my forgotten past anymore. It was here. It had been waiting for me. My muscles went rigid. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I pushed myself up from the chair. The movement was clumsy, jerky, a puppet with its strings cut. I have to go. Where are you going, Leo? Dr. Miles asked. He hadn't moved. He was still perched on the edge of his desk, watching me with that same, calm, analytical gaze. It wasn't the look of a doctor anymore. It was the look of a biologist observing a specimen in a jar. Back to the underpass? I doubt she's still waiting for you. The world tilted. My breath hitched in my throat. The underpass. The concrete walls. The smell of urine and rain. The place on the map I hadn't gone to yet. The place I only knew from a single, nightmarish flash of memory. His smile widened. It was too wide for his face. It was a predator smile. Or are you going to find another mirror to talk to? Maybe a nice, clean one this time. It must be difficult, seeing your own face, knowing what's underneath. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing the thin membrane of my reality. He knew. He knew everything. The places I'd been. The things I'd done in those places. The things I couldn't remember doing. He wasn't helping me. He was playing with me. The entire structure of my hope, my sanity, my last chance at being saved, collapsed into dust in the space of a single heartbeat. There was no one to trust. There was nothing to hold on to. The voice on the TV was right. It was time to face the truth. The truth was that the whole world was the trap. I didn't say anything. I turned and fled. I bolted from his office, my feet pounding on the soft carpet. I ran down the short corridor, back toward the entrance. The plan is proceeding, Leo, his voice called after me, still calm, almost cheerful. You're doing wonderfully. I didn't look back. I burst through the waiting room. My eyes snagged on the receptionist's desk as I passed. The computer monitor was on, its screen glowing in the dim light. It wasn't on a screensaver. A calendar program was open, and I saw it. In the slot for 11 p.m. tonight. My name wasn't there. The appointment was booked under a single word. Storm. And next to it, in a small field for notes, was a short, typed sentence. The letters were black and clinical on the white screen. I read them in a single horrifying glance as I ran past. Subject has returned. Reclamation plan progressing as scheduled. I hit the glass door with my shoulder and stumbled out into the silent, empty hallway. The elevator button glowed when I jabbed it with my thumb. I could hear the machinery whirring, pulling the car up from the garage below. It was the slowest sound in the world. I looked back at the glass door. I couldn't see him. The only thing I saw was my own reflection. A pale, terrified man with wide eyes, a burned hand clutched to his chest, waiting for a box to carry him down into the dark. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of my own terrified face. The descent was a smooth, silent drop. I didn't breathe. My burned hand was a hot weight against my ribs. The chime on the ground floor was an electric shock. The doors opened onto the vast concrete emptiness of the parking garage. The air was cold, thick, with the smell of old exhaust and damp cement. I ran. My footsteps slapped against the floor, each one an impossibly loud report in the quiet. I fumbled with my keys, the metal slick with sweat. The car door clicked open with a sound like a starting gun. I didn't go home. The thought of that apartment, of the chalk letters on the wall, made my stomach clench. The words from the clinic's computer screen were burned into my mind. Reclamation plan progressing. I was not a patient, I was a project. I drove without a destination, the engine a low growl against the sleeping city. The orange glow of the streetlights washed over the dashboard in a steady, rhythmic pulse. My hands shook. The damp print of my good hand was slick on the steering wheel. I needed light. I needed people. I saw the bright, sterile glow of a 24-hour convenience store and swerved into the parking lot, the tires complaining against the asphalt. Inside, the lights were a painful white. A single teenager with headphones on sat behind the counter, staring at his phone. The air hummed with the sound of refrigeration units. It was a pocket of artificial daytime in the deep of the night. I walked the aisles, my feet unsteady. I grabbed a bottle of water, a bag of pretzels. I didn't want them, but the act of choosing, of holding something solid, was an anchor. At the counter, I pulled a few crumpled bills from my pocket. Coins fell from my grasp, scattering across the grimy linoleum floor. One rolled under the edge of the candy rack. "Shit," I muttered. I kneeled, my joints protesting. The floor was sticky under my hand. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of a quarter. Then something else. Something wooden and rough. I reached under the rack, my fingers closing around a small, heavy object. I pulled it out. It was a compass. Old, made of a dull, tarnished brass. The glass face was hazed with a film of dust and grime. I rubbed it with my thumb. There was no brand name, just the simple NESW markings. The needle, a thin sliver of blued steel, was not still. It quivered, spun in a slow, lazy circle, then another. It ignored the magnetic pull of the earth. It stopped, pointing not north, but directly toward the front door of the store. I looked up. The cashier hadn't moved. The street outside was deserted. It was just a broken piece of junk. I pocketed it along with the change and left. Back in the car, I tossed the compass onto the passenger seat. The brass made a dull clink against the vinyl. I twisted the cap off the water and drank. The cold liquid a painful shock to my tight throat. I finished half the bottle before I stopped, my stomach aching. I put the key in the ignition. The moment I turned it, the radio crackled to life. It wasn't on the station I'd left it on. It was tuned to a dead frequency, a wall of static. Then, through the hiss, a sound emerged. The dry rustle of leaves and a steady wind. And then another sound, clearer and closer. The deep, two-note call of an owl. Hoo-hoo! I froze, my hand on the gearshift. The sound was clean, a perfect recording looping through the static. My eyes fell to the floor of the car. The map was still there, a crumpled piece of paper by the passenger side door. I leaned over and picked it up. My fingers traced the lines I now knew so well. The warehouse, the motel, the underpass I hadn't gone to. And then there was another X, one I hadn't focused on before. It wasn't in the city grid. It was in a patch of green on the edge of the map, a park or a reservation. The area was circled in the same red ink. And next to it, a handwritten note. My handwriting. Hoot Owl Trail. I looked at the compass on the seat. The blue needle was steady. It was pointing straight ahead, down the road, in the direction of the woods marked on the map. A coincidence? It had to be. A broken compass pointing in a random direction, a stray signal on the radio. But Dr. Miles's voice echoed in my head. The plan is proceeding. This felt like the next step. I didn't want to take it. I wanted to drive to a police station. But what would I say? My psychiatrist is trying to reclaim me? There's a chalk monster in my apartment? They would lock me up. The compass needle did not waver. The owl hooted again from the speakers. It was a summons. With a feeling of grim inevitability, I put the car in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, following the direction of the needle. The drive took 20 minutes. The city lights fell away, replaced by the dark, looming shapes of trees lining the road. The entrance to the park was just a gravel turnout with a wooden sign so whether the letters were almost gone. Hoot Owl Trail. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, save for the low, rhythmic chirp of crickets. The radio died with the car. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, its beam weak and yellow. The trailhead was marked by a small post. The path was clear at first, a worn track of earth through the ferns and underbrush. The air smelled of damp soil and decaying leaves. The beam of my flashlight cut a nervous, bouncing hole in the oppressive dark. Trees crowded in on both sides, their branches interlocking high overhead, blotting out the stars and the moon. The only sounds were my own breathing and the crunch of my footsteps on the dry leaves. The owl from the radio was gone, but now a real one called out from the darkness to my right, a haunting, mournful sound that raised the hair on my arms. I walked for what felt like an hour. The path began to narrow. The trees grew thicker, their trunks a solid wall of black in the thin light. I felt a branch snag on my jacket, and I turned to pull it free. When I turned back, the path was gone. I swept the flashlight beam back and forth. Nothing. Where the worn dirt track should have been, there was only a dense, seamless wall of tangled bushes and thick tree trunks. It was impossible. I had just been walking on it. I turned around, intending to backtrack. But the path behind me was gone too. I was standing in a small, enclosed clearing, surrounded on all sides by an impenetrable mass of vegetation. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced my chest. "No," I whispered. I pushed against the wall of branches. They were stiff, unyielding. Thorns tore at my hands and my face. I pushed harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was like shoving against a solid wall. The owl hooted again, this time seeming to come from directly above me. Then another answered it from my left, and a third from my right. The air was full of their calls, a disorienting chorus coming from every direction at once. I was trapped. The forest had closed in around me. That's when I heard it. Over the sound of the owls and my own hammering pulse, there was a new sound. The sharp snap of a dry twig under a heavy foot. I froze, shutting off the flashlight. The darkness was total. I held my breath, straining my ears. Silence. Then, another snap. Closer this time. Someone was in here with me. Someone was moving through the trees with a heavy, deliberate tread. I started to back away, my hands held out in front of me, feeling for obstacles. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the air knocked from my lungs. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, dirt and sharp stones digging into my palms. The footsteps kept coming, a steady, unhurried pace. They weren't chasing me, they were hurting me. I could hear the rustle of clothing, the heavy breathing. I half crawled, half ran, blind and desperate. A low sound of terror caught in my throat. I broke through a curtain of low-hanging branches and tumbled down a short, steep embankment, landing in a heap of damp leaves and mud at the bottom. The fall jarred every bone in my body. I lay still for a second, then pushed myself backward, pressing my spine against the cold, solid surface of a large, moss-covered rock. The footsteps stopped. Directly above me, at the top of the small slope, I could hear the person breathing, a slow, deep sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My burned hand throbbed with a white, hot pain. This is it. This is the end. I waited for a voice, for a light. There was only a high, whistling sound, a rush of air. Thump! The ground next to my head erupted. Dirt and pebbles sprayed across my face, stinging my skin. I flinched, crying out, my eyes flying open. A shovel blade was buried in the earth not 3 inches from my temple. The wood of the handle was new, clean. It quivered from the force of the impact. There was no one holding it. The shovel stood there, planted in the ground by itself. The footsteps at the top of the slope began to move away, the same heavy, deliberate tread, retreating back into the woods. I didn't move. I stared at the shovel, at the clean slice it had made in the dark soil. I lay there, my cheek pressed into the cold mud, listening until the footsteps faded into nothing. I stayed behind the rock for a long time. I don't know how long. Time had ceased to have meaning. Then, I felt a drop of water on my forehead. Then, another. A slow, steady rain began to fall, pattering on the leaves above, hissing softly in the darkness. The drizzle turned into a downpour. The cold water soaked through my jacket, my shirt, chilling me to the bone. It ran in rivulets down the slope where I lay, turning the dirt to slick mud. Eventually the fear gave way to a profound exhaustion. I knew I couldn't stay here. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. The shovel was still there, a bizarre monument in the rain. I gave it a wide berth and started to climb the muddy slope. My foot slipped, my hand plunged deep into the soft, wet earth to steady myself. My fingers touched something hard. Not a rock. It was thin and strangely smooth. Cautiously, I scraped away the mud. A sliver of white was revealed in the gloom. I dug more, my heart beginning to pound again with a new kind of dread. The rain washed the mud from my fingers as I worked, revealing more of the object. It was a finger. A human finger, skeletal and pale. I scraped faster, my breath catching in my throat. I uncovered another finger, then another. It was a hand, reaching up from the shallow grave. The flesh was mostly gone, leaving behind a brown, leathery wrap over the bones. The rain washed more dirt away, and something on the ring finger caught the faint, ambient light. A small, simple band of silver. It gleamed, clean and bright, against the decaying bone. The rain had stopped, but the world was still dripping. Water dripped from the black skeletal branches of the trees. It ran in cold trickles down the back of my neck. Dawn was a smear of dirty gray in the sky, offering light but no warmth. My clothes were a second skin of cold mud and water. My burned hand was a dead weight, a constant, throbbing pulse of pain against my chest. I walked, putting one foot in front of the other because there was nothing else to do. The forest had spat me out onto a narrow dirt road, packed hard and rutted with old tire tracks. I followed it. My shoes squelched with every step. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. After 10 minutes, maybe 20, I saw something ahead. A dark shape leaning out from the side of the road, crooked and unnatural. As I got closer, I saw what it was. A mailbox, mounted on a weathered wooden post that slanted deeply to one side. It was made of tin, painted black once, now mostly a patchwork of rust and peeling paint. I stopped in front of it. Some impulse made me reach out. My fingers, numb with cold, scraped against the rusty metal door. I pulled it open. The hinge gave a high, thin screech that cut through the morning's quiet. Inside there was nothing but a nest of dead leaves and a single, desiccated spider. On the side of the box, letters had been painted in white. Most of the paint was gone, flaked away by years of sun and rain. But a few characters remained, clinging to the metal. I could make out the shape of the last 4 letters of a name. My name. A narrow track, little more than 2 bare strips of dirt with a line of tough weeds growing in the middle, led away from the mailbox and into the trees. It went uphill. I pulled the map from my jacket pocket. The paper was limp and damp, the ink slightly blurred, but the lines were still there. The last X, the biggest one, in the center of a crudely drawn circle. It wasn't in the city, it was here. There was no note next to it like the others, no clue or instruction. Just one word, written in a heavy, angry-looking script. My script. Home. Something flickered behind my eyes. Not a thought, but a flash of an image, like a single frame cut from a film. The dusty space under a bed, the pattern of the springs above, the sound of heavy footsteps on a wooden floor, walking back and forth. A sharp pain shot through my skull, starting behind my right eye and spreading like a web of cracks. I squeezed my eyes shut, my good hand pressing against my temple. The pain was a physical thing, a hot spike being driven into my head. When it receded, it left behind a dull ache and a metallic taste in my mouth. The house was at the top of the track, half hidden by a tangle of overgrown bushes and low-hanging branches. It was a 2-story box, its siding bleached to a pale leprous gray. The roof sagged in the middle. The windows on the second floor were dark, empty sockets. A porch ran along the front, its railing broken in several places, the steps coated in a slick layer of green moss. Weeds grew up through the floorboards. The place looked abandoned for decades. It felt dead. I climbed the steps, my feet slipping on the moss. The front door was a huge slab of wood, its dark green paint blistered and peeling. The doorknob was made of tarnished brass, the same dull color as the compass. I put my hand on it, expecting it to be locked, expecting to have to break a window. But the knob turned. With a low groan of protesting wood, the door swung inward into darkness. The air that rolled out to meet me was heavy. It smelled of dust, of trapped time, of decay. I hesitated on the threshold, then stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me. It wasn't the wind. It was a smooth, deliberate motion. It ended with a loud, final click. I spun around. I grabbed the knob and twisted. Nothing. It didn't budge. I pulled. I put my shoulder into the wood and pushed. It was like shoving against a wall of solid rock. My heart started a hard, fast rhythm against my ribs. No, I whispered to the door. The sound of my own voice was small and useless in the heavy air. I rattled the knob again, a frantic, desperate motion. The mechanism inside was solid. Locked. I turned back to the room. My eyes adjusted to the gloom. It was a large living room, and everything in it, every chair, the sofa, the tables, even a tall floor lamp, was covered in a plain white sheet. They stood like a crowd of pale, silent figures, their shapes made bulky and unfamiliar by the drapes. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of gray light that pierced the grime on the windows. The silence was complete. The house held its breath, waiting. Then, I heard it. From somewhere upstairs, a sound began. A piano. It was playing a simple tune, a child's practice exercise. A hesitant, three-note melody, played over and over. Plink, plink, plink. A pause, then again. Plink, 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 plink. The notes were out of tune, hollow and strange in the silent house. It was the only sound in the world. I had to get out. I went to the nearest window, my feet making no sound on the dusty floorboards. I grabbed the bottom of the white sheet covering a large armchair and ripped it away. A cloud of thick dust billowed out, making me cough. The chair beneath was old, its floral fabric faded. I ignored it and moved to the window. It was painted shut, thick layers of white paint, sealing the frame to the sill. I tried to force it. I braced my feet and heaved, my muscles straining. Wood splintered under my fingernails, but the window didn't move. Plink, plink, plonk. The music continued its endless loop, soft and patient. It was coming from directly above my head. It was a summons. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against the slow, deliberate rhythm of the piano. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to find a corner and hide. But the music pulled at me. The house wouldn't let me leave. It only offered one way forward. Up. The stairs were in a hall off the main room. They rose into a well of deeper darkness. I put my foot on the first step. The wood creaked loudly, a sharp report in the quiet. I froze, listening. The piano upstairs did not stop. Plink, plink, plonk. I took another step. Another creak. I went up slowly, one step at a time, my good hand trailing along the gritty wallpapered wall. The air grew colder as I ascended. The smell of dust became stronger. The piano music grew clearer, louder. It seemed to be coming from a room at the end of the upstairs hall. A door stood partly open, a vertical slice of profound black. I reached the top of the stairs. The hallway floor was bare wood. The piano was very loud now, right behind that door. I walked toward it, my wet shoes leaving dark prints on the dusty floor. I pushed the door. It swung open without a sound. The piano stopped. The sudden silence was more jarring than the music had been. It pressed in on my ears. The room was a bedroom. In the center of it stood a small figure. A boy. His back was to me. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. He was just standing there, perfectly still. My throat was dry. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just watched his small, still form. "You're back?" The voice was not a child's. It was clear and cold, with no inflection. It came from the boy, but it didn't fit him. It made the hair on my arms stand up. Slowly, methodically, the boy began to turn. He didn't turn like a kid, full of quick, jerky movements. He rotated smoothly, as if on a mechanism, his feet planted on the floor. First his shoulders, then his waist, then his head. His face came into view. It was pale and smooth. The eyes were dark. It was my face, from a photograph my mother used to keep on her dresser. Me, at 10 years old. He looked at me, his expression blank. "Storm has been waiting for you," he said. And then he smiled. It was the smile from the mirror in my apartment, the smile that didn't use the right muscles. It stretched the corners of his small mouth too far, pulling the skin tight across his cheeks in a grotesque, predatory grin that belonged on the face of a wolf. It was a smile of pure, vicious welcome. I blinked. A hard, long blink, a convulsive reaction of terror. When I opened my eyes, he was gone. The room was empty. My breath came out in a ragged gasp. I stumbled back against the doorframe, my legs weak. I looked around the room again, my eyes darting into the corners. It wasn't the same room I had just seen. The white sheets were gone. There had never been any white sheets. The furniture, a bed with a bare, stained mattress, a simple wooden dresser, a small desk, was uncovered, stark and plain. Everything was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of gray dust, except for the walls. The walls were not bare. From the floor to the ceiling, every inch of the peeling wallpaper was covered. It was a collage, a sprawling, chaotic mosaic of paper. I took a step closer, my dread coiling into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. They were photographs. And newspaper clippings, hundreds of them, pinned to the wall with small, black tacks. I saw the faces of smiling high school seniors from yearbooks. I saw grainy photos of families on camping trips. I saw driver's license photos, stark and official. Underneath the photos were the clippings. Headlines cut from newspapers. Hiker vanishes from Oak Ridge Trail. College student missing after leaving library. Search called off for local man. They were all from the surrounding counties, spanning years. A gallery of ghosts. A catalog of disappearances and unsolved deaths. All of them connected by geography. And all of them without an answer. My eyes scanned the horrific collection. The faces, the names, the dates. This wasn't a bedroom. This was not a child's room. It was a war room. It was a trophy room. I backed away from the wall. My foot caught on something and I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the bare mattress. The springs screeched. My breath was loud in the room. The faces on the wall watched me. Hundreds of eyes. The missing hiker. The college student. The smiling families. A gallery of the dead and the gone. My head throbbed. A low, deep beat that matched the pulse in my throat. This was not a place. It was a file. A list of accomplishments. My stomach turned. I lurched to my feet and saw a door I hadn't noticed before, next to the dresser. A bathroom. I pushed it open and practically fell inside, fumbling for a light switch that wasn't there. Gray light filtered through a small, grimy window high on the wall. A toilet. A sink. A medicine cabinet with a mirrored door. The mirror was spotted with age, the silvering flaking away at the edges like black mold. I leaned over the sink, my good hand gripping the porcelain edge. It was cold and gritty with dust. I twisted the tarnished chrome faucet. A groaning shudder ran through the pipes in the wall. Then a gout of rust-colored water sputtered into the basin. It cleared after a few seconds, running thin and cold. I cupped my hands and splashed the water on my face. It was icy, making my skin prickle. It did nothing to clear my head. The faces were still there, imprinted on the inside of my eyelids. Search called off. Hiker vanishes. I straightened up slowly, water dripping from my chin onto the floor. I looked at myself in the mirror. The face looking back was a stranger's. Gaunt, pale, a smear of dirt on one cheek, eyes wide, pupils huge in the dim light. My burned hand was cradled against my chest, a useless, bandaged claw. I looked broken. I looked afraid. My reflection smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was slow, deliberate, a humorless stretching of the lips that didn't reach the eyes. The eyes in the mirror were cold, assessing. They held a different kind of light. A possessive light. Back quote. Like what you see. Back quote. The voice wasn't out loud. It came from inside my skull, clear as a bell, spoken in a calm, conversational tone. It vibrated behind my ears. I took a step back, my heel bumping against the toilet. The smile in the mirror widened. Back quote. It's our work. Be proud. Back quote. No, I whispered. My own voice was a dry rasp. A flash. White hot and blinding. It wasn't a thought. It was a memory. Injected directly into my brain. The cheap, scratchy feel of a polyester bedspread in a motel room. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and pine-scented air freshener. A woman on the bed, her face a mask of pleading terror. She was saying my name. Not my name. Another name. A name I knew like my own heartbeat. Storm. She was begging. The sound her head made when it hit the nightstand. Not a loud crack. A dull, wet impact. The splintering of cheap particle board, the lamp falling, the bulb shattering with a soft pop. I cried out, my hands flying to my head. The pain was immense, a physical presence, as if my skull was trying to split open from the inside. I squeezed my eyes shut. Another flash. The underside of a concrete bridge. The drip, drip, drip of water from an expansion joint, each drop echoing. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and exhaust fumes. A man on his knees. He was crying, snot and tears running down his face. He was trying to say something, but his jaw was broken. The words came out as a gargled mess. My hands were around the handle of a shovel. Not my good hand and my burned hand. Both hands were whole, strong. I remembered the weight of the shovel as I lifted it, the satisfying heft of it, the way the muscle in my back and shoulders coiled, then released. The first blow wasn't to his head, it was to his legs. The sound of bone snapping was sharp, like a dry stick breaking. His scream was high and thin in the enclosed space. Stop, I begged, but the voice in my head just laughed. It was a soft, cruel sound. Backquote. Stop? We were just getting started. Backquote. The bathroom started to tilt. The floor felt like the deck of a ship in a storm. I slid down the wall, my back scraping against the peeling paint, and sat hard on the grimy linoleum. The memories were not flashes now. They were a flood, a torrent of images and sensations pouring into me, drowning the person I thought I was. The quiet man in the apartment. The man with no past. That man was a fiction. A ghost. The old woman at the bus station, the one with the kind eyes, clutching her purse as I walked past. I remembered wanting to see the fear in her eyes. The teenage couple in the parked car on the scenic overlook, their laughter cut short. The weight of the rock in my hand. The sound of the glass shattering, their screams. A beautiful harmony. And then, the car. My car. The steering wheel slick in my hands. I wasn't running from anything. I wasn't being chased. I was on a dark, empty road, and I felt something I had never felt before. A flicker. A tiny, alien spark of regret. A moment of clarity. I saw the faces. All of them. The woman in the motel. The man under the bridge. The hikers. Dozens of them. A lifetime of torment inflicted on others. The sheer scale of it was, for one single, solitary second, too much. A crack in the perfect cold facade. Backquote. A moment of weakness. Backquote. The voice in my head sneered, contemptuously. Backquote. Disgusting. Backquote. I remembered turning the wheel. Hard. The feeling of the car leaving the road. The jolt as it hit the ditch. The slow, grinding screech of metal as it rolled. The world tumbling, green and black, trees and sky-swapping places. And then the impact. A final, explosive stop. The world went black. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a failed execution. The monster had tried to kill itself. But it didn't die. It just broke. And in the silent, broken space it left behind, something else was born. A new person. A blank slate. A man who woke up in a hospital with no name and no memory. A man named An. Me. I was the scar tissue. The amnesia wasn't a wound. It was a cage. And the map. I didn't find the map. It wasn't a clue to my past. It was a failsafe. A breadcrumb trail left by the monster, for the monster. A contingency plan created by a brilliant, predatory mind, in case its own moment of weakness ever led to this. Each X wasn't a memory to uncover. It was a trigger. Each location, saturated with the violence of the past, was designed to act as a key, slowly unlocking the cage from the inside. The apartment. The bridge. The motel. And now, this house. The final key. The master key. Home. N is a lie, the voice roared, no longer calm, no longer conversational. It was a raw, commanding bellow that shook me to my bones. "You are a disease, a symptom, a ghost haunting my house. I am real," I screamed. It wasn't a word, just a sound of pure agony torn from my throat. I clawed at my scalp, my fingernails digging into my skin. The pain in my head was a white-hot nova, incinerating thought. The memories and feelings that were me, the confusion, the fear, the desperate hope for a normal life, felt thin, fragile, like old paper, and they were burning up, being erased. In their place, something else was rising, something cold and hard and vast. The calculated cruelty, the joy in another's fear, the meticulous planning, the hunger. It was a hostile takeover of my very soul. My entire journey, the one I thought was a search for myself, was a lie. It was a ritual, a long, slow path of self-destruction, each step I took bringing this thing, the real thing, closer to the surface. I hadn't been finding a monster. I had been methodically, painstakingly reassembling it. The screaming stopped. It just ended. The pain in my head receded, leaving behind a profound and absolute clarity. The shaking in my limbs ceased. I took a breath. It was steady, even. I placed my good hand flat on the floor and pushed myself up. My movements were no longer frantic or weak. They were smooth, economical, efficient. I stood in the center of the small bathroom, my feet planted. I looked at the wall of clippings through the doorway. It was not a horror. It was a legacy. It was my work. I felt a swell of something I hadn't felt since I woke up in that hospital. Pride. I turned back to the mirror. I looked into my own eyes. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. The desperate, pleading weakness of Anne was gone, wiped clean. All that remained was a cold, sharp, intelligent light, an unsettling stillness, a complete and total presence. I recognized the man in the mirror. I knew him intimately. I smiled. It was my smile. It was perfect. It used all the right muscles. "Welcome back," I whispered. The voice was mine again, the real one. The story I had been telling myself was over. The man who had been telling it was dead. I stepped out of the bathroom. The air in the house was different. It no longer felt foreign or hostile. It felt like my own skin. My bare feet made soft sounds on the wooden floorboards. A floor I now knew held a loose board 3 steps from the top of the stairs. I stepped over it without thinking. The muscle memory was not mine from a week ago, but from a lifetime ago. It was effortless. My movements were no longer the frantic, stumbling gait of a frightened animal. They were fluid, measured, conserving energy. My hand, the good one, trailed along the dusty top of the banister as I descended. The grime felt familiar, a fine powder that coated my fingertips. I didn't wipe it off. At the bottom of the stairs, I turned left, into the living room. The furniture was draped in white sheets, pale, lumbering shapes in the gloom. Anne knew them as ghosts. I knew them as a couch, 2 armchairs, and a coffee table. I walked to the nearest window and pulled back the edge of a sheet covering it. The fabric was stiff with age and dust. Outside, the moon was a sliver, casting long, distorted shadows from the overgrown trees. The world was quiet. The oppressive, watching silence that had tormented Anne was gone. Because the watcher was no longer hiding in the walls. He was looking out the window. I let the sheet fall back into place. It settled with a soft whoosh, sending a cloud of dust motes, dancing in the single beam of moonlight piercing the gloom from another window. I continued my tour. I moved from the living room into the dining room. The long wooden table was bare, coated in the same layer of dust as everything else. My fingers brushed its surface, leaving clean tracks in the gray film. 10 chairs. My father at the head, my mother at the foot. Me on the right, 3rd one down. I could feel the phantom weight of the silverware in my hands, hear the non-existent clink of a glass being set down. These were not memories that assaulted me. They were data points. Environmental context. I went into the kitchen. The linoleum was cracked and yellowed, peeling up at the corners. It was cold under my feet. I opened a cupboard. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, a few chipped plates and a single mug sat on a shelf. The mug had a cartoon bird on it. I remembered it being full of hot chocolate. The memory held no warmth. It was just a fact. I closed the cupboard. I walked to the refrigerator. It was an old model, humming with a low, constant vibration that I could feel through the soles of my feet. I pulled the handle. The seal gave way with a sticky, tearing sound, and the interior light flickered on, casting a pale, sickly yellow glow. It was empty save for a single unopened bottle of water on the door. Condensation beaded on the clear plastic. I took it. My thirst wasn't a desperate need, but a simple mechanical requirement. I twisted the cap off and drank. The water was cool, tasteless. It did its job. I screwed the cap back on and set the bottle on the counter. My jacket was still slung over the back of one of the dining room chairs, where Anne had dropped it in his panic. I walked back and retrieved it. I put it on. The weight was comforting. My hand slid into the inner pocket and pulled out the map. It felt different now, no longer a cryptic puzzle box, but a completed assignment. A final report. I sat down at the dusty dining table, in my old chair, third one down on the right. I spread the map out. The paper was soft, worn at the creases. The marks Anne had made, the frantic circles around the bridge, the motel, were like a child's scribbles over a blueprint. The final X, over this very house, was the end of his road. My finger, the index finger of my good hand, traced the route. The gas station where I'd bought a coffee, the overlook where he'd stared into the woods, the winding road to the bridge, the drab motel on the highway. The final, long drive here. A pilgrimage in reverse, not a path to discovery, but a meticulous erasure of a flawed creation. Each stop had been a jolt, a key turning in a lock deep inside the skull, weakening the walls of the cage Anne had built for me. And this house, saturated with the origins of my entire being, was the master key that had shattered the lock completely. I looked at the X's. They were not scars. They were monuments. A gallery of accomplishments, just like the one on the bedroom wall upstairs. The work. The only thing that mattered. I turned the map over in my hands. The back was blank. A pale, empty field of aged paper. It was an invitation. An unfinished page. The story Anne had been telling himself was over. But my story was a long one. And it had been on hiatus for too long. I stood and walked over to the small desk, tucked into a corner of the kitchen. A roll top, a style that hadn't been popular in decades. I opened it. More dust. The smell of old paper and dry ink. The drawers were stiff. I pulled the top one open. It resisted, then gave way with a sharp screech of wood on wood. Inside, a jumble of forgotten things. Dried up pens. Brittle rubber bands that snapped when I touched them. A scatter of paper clips, some of them rusted. And a single ballpoint pen, its plastic casing a bright, chemical red. I picked it up. I clicked the button on the end. A small, sharp sound in the quiet kitchen. The nib extended. I went back to the dining room table, back to the map. I stood over it, looking down. Through the window I could see the distant glow of the city against the dark clouds. A sprawling web of lights and lives. Thousands upon thousands of them, moving, breathing, sleeping. Safe in their beds, believing the world made sense. An ecosystem humming along in blissful ignorance. They had no idea a predator had returned to the food chain. The silence in the house was no longer a threat, it was an accomplice. It was the quiet of a workshop after the tools have been laid out and before the real work begins. I placed the tip of the red pen on the black X that marked the house. The ink was a stark, wet red against the faded black, an artery opening. I paused, not from hesitation, but for the pleasure of the moment. The precipice. Then, I began to draw. The pen moved with a steady, confident pressure. I didn't need to consult a road atlas. The geography was imprinted in my mind. The line moved away from the house, tracing the path of the old county highway. It was a smooth, unbroken stroke. It wound east, bypassing the small towns Anne had crept through. It crossed the thin blue line that marked the river. The line entered the outskirts of the city, the part of the map that was a dense grid of streets and blocks. My hand didn't slow. I navigated the printed streets with an architect's precision. A right turn onto a main thoroughfare. A left onto a smaller artery. The lines sliced through neighborhoods, a red vein pushing its way toward the heart. The pen made a soft, scratching sound on the paper, the only sound in the room. This was not the erratic impulse of a madman. This was logistics. Planning. The groundwork for a new masterpiece. Anne had searched for a monster. I was providing a new one. My line slowed as it moved into a tightly packed residential area. blocks of identical houses, rows of sleeping families. The perfect hunting ground. I stopped the line in the center of one of these blocks. I lifted the pen, looked at the red path I had drawn. A direct route from my resurrection to my next stage. It was clean, efficient. I lowered the pen again, to the end point of the red line. I pressed down. The ballpoint dug into the soft paper, leaving a deep channel. I drew the first stroke of a new X, then the second. Crossing it, I made it larger than the others. Bolder. The red ink pooled slightly where the lines intersected, a dark, heavy clot. A promise. I looked at it. The new X. The target. A profound sense of purpose washed over me. A feeling as clean and cold as the water I had drunk. The weakness, the brief flicker of regret that had caused the crash, was a distant anomaly. A statistical error that had been corrected. I clicked the pen. The red tip retracted. I placed it on the table next to the map. Carefully, I folded the map. I followed the original creases, my fingers pressing down to make the edges sharp, first in half, then in half again. The new red line was hidden inside. I slid the folded square of paper back into the inner pocket of my jacket. It rested against my chest. I stood up. The chair made no sound as I pushed it back. I walked to the front door, my steps even and unhurried. I pulled it open. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. It felt good. I stepped over the threshold, onto the porch. My feet found the old, familiar steps down to the overgrown path. I did not look back at the house. I did not close the door. I left it open. A black, waiting rectangle in the moon-dusted facade. A vacant space. The cycle was not over. It had just been rebooted.